While the winds of change are sweeping through Africa as former French colonies push to sever ties with the G7 power, signaling a bold new era fueled by revolutionary fervor. But as the echoes of independence grow louder, one question remains: is France a force for good or the architect of a lingering imperialist agenda? How will history judge its legacy, development partner or colonial overlord? My name is Abdullahi Ahmed. We're coming to you live from our studio in Nigeria's capital, Abuja, and this is France in Africa. Let's introduce you to our panel. Our first panelist is a veteran diplomat who needs no introduction when it comes to developments on the African continent. He is, of course, served on the ECOWAS Commission and has had a wide range of understanding of what's happening in the international scene. His take on today's conversation is that France is the master colonialist of Africa. Ambassador Haruna Warkani is joining us for this conversation. Ambassador, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you, viewers.
How important is this conversation in the grand scheme of things, considering the temperature of the continent and all of the events, especially of the past 2 years?
Well, I think, let me say, maybe this might be the second most momentous period for Africa after the 1960s general independence of countries across the continent. Today seems to be the second phase of the actual independence of African states, because the last colonialist who has been so unwilling to go looks like set to finally leave, because people have come to the realization that this colonialist that has forgotten to go or refused to go is finally being pushed to go. And the day France leaves Africa, that will be the effective date of independence of African states. There has never been any colonialist as worst as France. None. Because
why do you say that?
Yes, France's attributes in Africa is incomparable to all the other colonial masters. We have Belgium, we have Germans, we have the British, the Portuguese, Spaniards, who all have come, including the Arabs, have come to Africa, taken whatever they will need to take, and some of them finally accepted to leave or forced to leave. France, however, has managed to stay, and not only staying, but has continued to plunder the continent such that the various parts of Africa are truly not free. We might claim to be independent, or some states might claim to be independent, but they are not free. And so there is hardly any colonial master that can be compared with France. The atrocities of the Belgians, King Leopold particularly in Belgian Congo, DRC now, as you can see, the aftermath of that brutal colonialism is still what is unfolding in the DRC even as of today.
All right.
Now in the case of France, from Algeria, where you had the worst civil protest, civil conflict before Algeria could get its independence from France. It's, uncompared to any recorded history of atrocities, to today's present, what would I say, denial of rights of citizens of countries that are claimed to be independent. All the Francophone countries in West Africa, for instance, since none of them can still claim to be free, you have a country that is supposed to be sovereign, and yet It has no central bank of its own, no currency of its own, no army truly of its own, no economy or economic policies of its own, and some even, worse still, are paying rent to France for their palace. Seat of power in Cote d'Ivoire is still a French property, rented. How would you describe that kind of colonialism? Thank God the Portuguese came, it couldn't last, they have gone. The Germans tried war scenarios in Namibia and some other places, it couldn't last, they have gone. The British did whatever they could. Nigeria scared them stone dry and they had to quickly leave. But the atrocities they committed in, let's say, Kenya through the Mama movement and the rest of them, the scars are still all over the place. But for the French, the atrocities committed by France on this continent is beyond measure.
Right. So let's properly give some sort of context to this conversation. If you have to put the good, and I'm assuming there is some good over the past decades, versus the bad, which outweighs the other?
It is unfair to even compare the two, because sincerely, assuming, we also have to assume that there must be like a central position that is neither here nor here, so that whichever outweighs the other could have taken the lead. In this case, there is hardly anything good you can say of the French here on the continent, because sincerely, for a country to have accepted on its own by its former leaders to have said, if not for Africa, France would have become a developing country up to today. They have nothing to give the world other than their culture and tradition, nothing. They have taken everything from Africa and made the good out of it for their own benefit and their own benefit alone. The mineral resources which they have inherited from all the colonies, is what France has used to build itself to date. They have, you cannot believe it, they have mined uranium from Niger, stockpiled in France, and selling to other countries as if they are the owners of this mineral. There's nothing more exploitative than that. So time has come. We as Africans need to open up. We need to speak up. We need to oppose this atrocious activity of a colonial power that has no reason to have even been in Africa in the first place.
Right. So when you see this, the departure of French forces across the Sahelian states, across some of their former colonies, is this the beginning of the end for France in Africa?
Indeed, thank God for good. This is the very beginning for France in Africa, but largely for anything related to colonialism anywhere, anytime, or imperialism, generally around the world. And then the brigandage of the developed West to Africa in particular. I think this is a clear signal that Africans are fed up, we are tired, it's enough. They have plundered enough. They should therefore find a way to go back home and let us manage our resources. Whichever way it comes, it is still better for us to make our own mistakes, correct it, and get a way forward. If we had been on our own since the 60s, for instance, it couldn't have been, like this. You see, take a country like Rwanda. Rwanda had to, out of frustration, drop the French language as an official language and adopted another one because of what it did during the genocide of 1994. If a country can reach that level of taking such a drastic decision, you know that something must be wrong with this country. And we have seen how so bad they have managed our affairs in the early 60s up to now,
right,
by changing governments that did not agree with them. Any government that did not accept to be a puppet was removed like a T-shirt. Overnight, any leader could have just been removed from power and another one supplanted once you say you are against France. And that has been the practice since then. So they have, I think, amassed for themselves a very bad reputation, not just as a bad colonial master, but I think the worst.
Right. The French president recently said, quote, "We had a security relationship. It was in two folds. One was our commitment against terrorism since 2013. I think someone forgot to say thank you. It does not matter. It will come with time." He went further to say this, quote, "Ingratitude, I'm well placed to know, is a disease not transmissible to man." Basically saying that there is a certain part of Africa that owes France gratitude of thanks.
We really don't. Rather, it is the reverse. We really, really don't. There is no basis and no good reason under the sun to expect France with this kind of overbloated importance in Africa. Indeed, were we as African countries to be truly united or capable of rethinking our actions, we should demand reparations from France. Because France is generally believed to be responsible for most of the terrorist activities on the continent. No doubt about it, because you go around, you see that the footprints of France are all over. Related to all this terrorism you see around us is French involvement. The greatest terrorist you can say, I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name exactly, but here is an individual that has been seen with Macron everywhere. Official dinners, official whatsoever. The next moment you see him with terrorists in Africa. The next moment he's linked to arms trade across Africa. I mean, how else would anyone want to look for evidence of France's footprints in Africa relating to insecurity? France claims to have military bases that were meant to protect Africa. Unfortunately, the same countries suffered attacks that you cannot sometimes explain. If you have a military base meant to protect a particular country, and there are jihadist incursions, killings, maiming, looting going on, and the soldiers are there, why are they there? These are the questions that our leaders ought to be asking. You cannot claim to come to support us, and at the end of the day, it is proven that you are actually the architect of this problem. I think we have that serious lacuna in Africa that France cannot wash itself away from all this. And I think the time has come. African leaders must do a rethink and try to do something different.
Is this a retreat or a surrender when you see French troops leaving Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, and the likes, and you see Senegal renegotiating its relationship with France, and you get this sense that the entire continent itself is sort of like taking a second look at the relationship it has with France? Is France retreating to re-strategize? Is this, as we did earlier say, a surrender that they've been successfully pushed out? Because I like to think that they still have some of their tentacles economically and politically in some of these former colonies.
France cannot surrender, so that is out of it. The word surrender, not for France, because when they surrender and go back home, that's the assumption. What will they be doing? Nothing. The remaining colonies they have around the world, this is one country that its colonialism has become so pervasive.
You don't think they are former colonies? You think they are still colonies?
Plenty of them.
They are still colonies?
Plenty of them. Some of the island nations in Polynesia, around Polynesia and the rest of them are still colonies, literally speaking. Mayotte and the rest of them, they are still colonies. They don't have a say. They don't have that kind of sovereignty. And so France dictates what happens. Therefore, this is the only European country remaining that is still exercising colonialism across the globe. within the context of the United Nations. So if you truly are a member of the United Nations Security Council, for instance, and you are still exercising colonial authority over territories and jurisdictions, you refuse to grant them independence. Some of them have cried and are tired. They've literally given up because some of these small island nations are too small to make an impact. There's no voice. There's nobody even to listen to them. So they have just taken that for granted to say, okay, whatever France says, that becomes it. But I think in Africa, particularly the African Union, needs to wake up and adopt some strategies to challenge some of these things, because a country cannot be here and frustrating unity and cohesion on the continent, and we allow it to continue as if nothing is happening. Right. It means we are either ignorant, we are complacent, or complicit.
Right. Let's bring in an additional voice to the conversation. Amsfree Ajanaku is the Executive Director, Grassroots Center for Rights and Civic Orientation. He's joined the conversation virtually from here in Abuja. Amsfree, as always, a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. Clearly, as a Nigerian,
Hello, Abdullahi. Thank you for having me.
Right. I know as a Nigerian and as an African, you have an opinion or two to say about this, but I'm going to ask you this question specifically as a Nigerian. When you see the rest of Africa, quote unquote, falling out of love or sort of the relationship with France, and then you see Nigeria's federal government embracing France, rebuilding this relationship with France, how do you read this development, especially looking at the big picture? Do we still have Amsfree on the line? Okay, we've lost our connection to Mr. Ajanaku. We're going to work and try to get him back to get his thoughts. Of course, there's a lot more to unpack there. But, just to, cue into that particular question.
Yes.
While our neighbors, right, that just recently left the ECOWAS Union,
definitely
have expressed their opinions about France. In fact, the military head of Niger made some damning statements recently about the connection between France and the terrorism that is engulfing the region, or that has been engulfing the region, connecting it to the federal government of Nigeria. Talk to me about what you make of the relationship between the Nigerian government and France, who is, say, the most unpopular player in this part of the continent.
Commenting on Nigeria and France will take one maybe many years backwards, first and foremost, to establish a background so that we can understand what really has been happening on up to this moment. If you are familiar with France, you will see that today we have more French companies operating in Nigeria than even our former colonial master Britain itself. Very strange, very strange, and it requires interrogation. It is interesting to note that France established its own company, the Peugeot Automobile Company in Kaduna around 1975. However, France instructed its African colonies not to bother to buy any of the vehicles assembled in Nigeria because they are of low quality. That's France for you. They were still exporting.
Is this a common subterfuge, so to say?
Well, of course it is, because for them, they still want to maintain an economy for themselves, and yet they are still milking us here. France has successfully frustrated the introduction of a single currency in West Africa through the ECOWAS scheme. If there was any action that made that single currency impossible, it is the interference of France. That's why France cannot be a friend to West Africa, and France should never be a friend to Nigeria in particular. Right. Officially, France classifies Nigeria as a neighbor you cannot avoid, in quotes, a neighbor they cannot avoid, because here we are surrounded by French-speaking countries, including maybe the sea, because what else will we say? France has surrounded us with its colonies, and yet they are uncomfortable because they believe we are too big and too influential to just be left alone. we would have substituted almost all the economic products in West Africa, assuming we had gotten our own right. Now, the new relationship that is emerging or building up from what was in the past, to see that France is one of our closest allies, when other countries are kicking out France every day, makes it very strange and disturbing, which is what these Sahel member states are saying.
You think we're going against the grain here?
Yeah, we are totally against the grain and totally against even common morality, common thinking, and common brotherhood in Africa that we should be promoting. So, see, this has created a problem for ECOWAS itself. It has created a problem for Nigeria. It has created a problem between and amongst some of these neighbors. Chad, of all places, had to make an observation that it looks like Nigeria is actually promoting Boko Haram because of France's involvement around the Lake Chad area. Niger felt like, okay, maybe we might need to build a boundary wall between Nigeria and Niger, despite the affinity, cultural, religious, economic, etc., between Nigeria and Niger. Because you cannot be fronting a new relationship with our greatest enemy and we still keep quiet. I think that's really bad for us as Nigerians, and our leaders need to do a rethinking. Yes, we have heard people, supporters of this government, saying our neighbors cannot dictate to us who should be our friend. Agreed. But they have a right to know what we are also doing.
Yeah, exactly. Amsri, I believe we have Amsri Ajanko back into the conversation. Amsri, let me get your quick take on how France is faring on the continent vis-a-vis its impact and, its history of what many would term has been very suspicious activity. Where do you stand looking back at the records and where things stand with France right now?
Absolutely, I agree with the ambassador. All the points made by the ambassador wholeheartedly. France has been a bad influence on the continent. Absolutely, there can be no mistaking that fact. And it has also come with a tinge of colonial arrogance. That whole idea of a civilizing mission, the fact that they have that understanding that the African man is yet to take a step into history, and they have not in any way hidden the fact that they see Africans as prehistoric. We have not yet taken our step into history. We are yet to make a mark on history. And so that supremacist mindset is what we see playing out in terms of the policies and the programs that the French colonial power has tended to pursue on the continent. But as we speak, the chickens are coming home to roost, because many of the colonial subjects are now beginning to have counter narratives to the narrative that France has kind of pushed on the continent for so long. Many of the colonial subjects are beginning to interrogate economic, cultural, and political dimensions of this kind of supremacist agenda on the continent, and that is why you are seeing the pushback. Unfortunately, one of the orphans of this whole pushback we are seeing, on the continent, is democracy itself. So, in a nutshell, the very important question you posed, in the course of the program, about whether or recolonization, I think it is a revolution deferred. A revolution deferred in the sense that the consciousness is beginning to rise that Africans have to take their destinies in their hands. But what is the methodology? What is the method to, amplifying that consciousness and ensuring that that consciousness becomes a pathway for African Renaissance? That is the fundamental question I believe is now confronting Africans that are rejecting French neocolonialism.
The irony in that statement is not lost on me, or at least the pun, Renaissance, which is something France knows quite a lot about. But one more question to you before we wrap things up, Amsfree. Where do you see this, taking the continent? I mean, it seems to be the easiest thing to do right now is to hate France. It's the one that we love to hate at the moment, especially looking back at all of those transgressions and whatnot. Where do you stand with regards to our relationship as Nigeria and how the rest of the continent is looking at us with suspicion, not falling in line, not expressing the solidarity that is to be expected, the Pan-Africanism that is to be expected, because for such a very long time, the Western powers have undermined the political and economic growth of the continent. Does France still have a friend in Nigeria looking at where things stand?
Yeah, so I think at the level of the political leadership, we have seen the Nigerian president, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, fraternizing with his French counterparts, and then trying to build that camaraderie between Nigeria and France at a time when France is receiving a lot of backlash and a lot of hostility on the continent. I think we need to tread with caution. I agree absolutely with the ambassador that African leaders need to tread with caution. And, Nigeria particularly needs to also understand that we should not jeopardize the good neighborliness, which France itself has made impossible, like the ambassador has rightly alluded to. France itself has made this cooperation practically impossible, especially in West Africa, because France believes that Nigeria's size, Nigeria's influence, and Nigeria's manifest destiny will be too much for it to accommodate its own influence in West Africa. And so it has done everything to drive a wedge between Nigeria and the rest of West Africa, especially the francophone part of francophone speaking Africa.
Right.
So in this context, I believe that Nigeria has to recalibrate its foreign policy, even everything symbolic.
Right.
Symbolism as little as standing side by side with the president of France is likely to send a very dangerous signal to the rest of West Africa, especially now that West Africa is rejecting French hegemony in our sub-region.
Interesting takes. Gentlemen, we're going to have to end it here for now. Amsfree Ajanaku, Executive Director, Grassroots Center for Rights and Civic Orientation. Thank you so much for joining me on the program, and we do appreciate your insight and expert analysis. There's a lot more to double down. Ambassador Haruna Warkani, as always, a pleasure having you join us on the program. Thank you so much for your expert analysis and, of course, your insightful thoughts about this all-important conversation. Thank you so much for
having me, and thank you, viewers.
Right, okay. That's it for this week's edition of the program. We'll be back next week with a lot more issues to unpack. Until next time, my name is Abdullahi Ahmed. Thank you for watching. We'll see you soon.